Welcome to the Food Junkies podcast. Here, we aim to bring you the experience, strength, and hope of professionals working on the front lines in the field of food addiction. Our mission is to educate you, the listener, and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a recognized disorder. Here, we discuss all things recovery, exploring the many pathways people take towards abstinence in order to achieve a health-forward lifestyle. We hope to inspire you to thrive rather than just survive. So stay positive, make a change for yourself, and share your journey with others. And hopefully the message will spread.
Imagine having a tool that would warn us of an impending relapse so that we could stop it in its tracks. Welcome to the Food Junkies podcast. My name is Dr. Vera Tarman, and I am your host today, speaking with Bob Messerschmidt, a biomedical engineer, inventor, and entrepreneur who helped design the health sensing architecture of the original Apple Watch. Bob believes he has such a tool, an inflammatory marker. As founder of Core Health, he developed an FDA-registered at-home device that uses a micro-USR measurement to track chronic low-grade inflammation over time. Bob has also worked for decades in scientific instrumentation and holds patents related to blood analysis and biomarker measurement. After improving his own metabolic health, he became convinced that low-grade inflammation is a common driver of many chronic conditions and that giving people an accessible, trackable inflammation marker can help them make better decisions, including avoiding relapses to disordered eating. For Food Junkies listeners, this is compelling because we know that inflammation and metabolic dysfunction often sit behind cravings, fatigue, mood shifts associated with ultra-processed foods. So welcome, Bob.
Thank you very much. That's a great intro. I appreciate that.
Would you like to tell us, first of all, how your own health journey led you to focus on a chronic low-grade inflammatory marker?
Absolutely. So I think like a lot of people in technology, I've spent many years focused on building tools and not thinking so much about my own health. I think this is the journey or the arc for humans in general. We start out thinking of ourselves as invincible, and then we realize, yeah, not the case. But I've my main issue over my life has been weight. I've struggled with weight like many people, and I've been able to get that better under control recently. And of course, during the time that I was developing the core device, which tracks a marker of inflammation, I noticed this very strong correlation. This is N of 1, of course, but I noticed that my inflammation dropped like a rock when I got my eating under control and I got my some of the weight off. It didn't even take a lot of the weight coming off to really see a statistically significant change in my systemic inflammation level. And so that obviously got me intrigued as a scientifically minded person. I wanted to dig in and find out what inflammation was all about. And that's, of course, the journey that has led me to the core device.
We'll get more of that story as we move along. I would like to know what helped you define or isolate that ESR particular marker.
Yeah,
Maybe you can also then define what ESR is for people.
yeah, you bet. I think it was not one event really that got me thinking about inflammation and inflammation markers. I was already deeply immersed in the idea of measuring blood-based biomarkers for people in a direct to consumer fashion. My experience at Apple led me to really think about how important information is to people if they can get it into their own hands and they can use it to improve their lives and their lifestyles. And also through that process of being able to understand that they can get a result, take an action, and then improve something, that process of self-efficacy is really, I ended up thinking through my time at Apple and beyond that that engagement process is really critical to health and wellness, that we really need to people need to be at the center of this feedback loop. The feedback loop needs to be immediate. You need to be able to give people a number in pseudo real time and you need to give it directly to people. People can handle the data. I'm not too worried about the argument that this sort of blood data should only go to clinicians. There's obviously an extremely important role designed really not in any way to conflict with the primary loop. So as I started digging in on inflammation, which I was reading more and more about, as to my reading, inflammatory processes are underpinning almost all chronic disease and even some acute disease. And that's a relatively new thing. So I'm always intrigued by new things, right? I think we've been measuring inflammation for many years, but really the understanding that it's seminal to all these chronic processes is fairly new. And so that's where my research started. The erythrocyte sedimentation rate is the full name for what we call ESR. It's a mouthful to say, but it's very descriptive. Basically, it's a measurement that's made in the red blood cells. So it's in a tiny blood sample. And the sedimentation rate means that your red cells, your erythrocytes, are clumping together and falling and separating from the blood plasma if you hold the blood in a vertical tube. So they're just falling under the force of gravity. So that sounds pretty simple, which it is. But what came after someone noticed that there was variability in this sedimentation rate through research and science, it was discovered that this sedimentation rate related to the prevalence of inflammatory proteins in the blood, which cause the red blood cells to clump together. And when they clump together, they become heavier and they fall more quickly. So a speeded up sedimentation rate, ESR, is strongly correlated with systemic inflammation, which in turn is strongly correlated with outcomes. And so it's a really wonderful marker. It doesn't diagnose anything. And so we tend to think of blood biomarkers as diagnostic, but there's another use for blood biomarkers, which is to track. And that tracking process is indeed the whole idea behind digital health, the idea that you can get a number that is, the requirement is that the number is meaningful and that it has dynamic range. And then you can track it and you can say, as you do events in your life, you can correlate those with the level of this marker. You do exactly the same thing if you're using a CGM, continuous glucose monitor. You do exactly the same thing if you're just monitoring some body worn number, heart rate variability or steps or resting heart rate or walking heart rate. It's all the idea being that you can see a trending in the data.
And in some cases, that data is meaningful. Like in this case, the ESR shows, high ESR would show marked inflammation, which indicates that there's some chronic disease happening or impending.
Yeah, you won't know what it is from the ESR, but you will know that there's something, and you could do a couple things in response to that. You could ask your doctor, and they could, if you were concerned about the level of rise, and they could look into it more from a medical perspective. Or there are people who want to but because this is really what it's all about, right? You really want to improve things that you're doing that might be causing your inflammation to be rising. So we empower and enable that loop.
So essentially you're saying it's a non-specific marker. It's a marker of inflammation, but it's non-specific. When I was in medical school many years ago, we were introduced to the ESR and then were discouraged from using it because it was so non-specific. But before we realized how important inflammation was to the conditions that we were actually studying.
That's true. That is a very good point. So it's before we really understood the importance of inflammation. It also doesn't give the clinical loop necessarily the information that it needs, because you as an MD want something that's more diagnostic, because you want to, provide some therapeutic or some understand where the process is and take some medical intervention. It's more like a sign. I almost view it as a vital sign. I almost view it like blood pressure. Blood pressure is, of course, one of the most causal, independent prognostic indicators of morbidity and mortality. But ESR in studies is nearly as good. So they can both be measured fairly easily now. Blood pressure you've been able to measure, although I could probably do another podcast about how people are measuring blood pressure incorrectly these days. But you pair that now with an inflammation marker, and you have a lot of good data.
So how could somebody use this marker? What causes a spike in ESR? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you use the word spike. So it doesn't really spike in the sense that glucose spikes postprandially. It is a more gentle curving of the data. There is good dynamic range to it. So in me personally, I've had my very best reading ever when I was like really working hard on my weight management and exercise and everything, diet. My ESR was at 7 millimeters per hour, which is world class. That is a number that you might have in your 20s. The ESR trends up with age, but I've had a number as high as 30. And so when mine starts, so there's good dynamic range to the number. We launched this product about a year ago, and we have thousands of them in the field, and we have tens of thousands of data points. So we had the question when we were developing the product, how prescriptive should we be, or how programmatic, I think is the better way to ask, should we be with suggesting lifestyle interventions? And again, my Apple training told me if I create programs, people aren't really going to follow those. And if I ask them to report a lot of data by entering it into a form or even on an app, no matter how nicely designed it is, people aren't really going to do that either. And ideally, you want to know what people are doing that's driving their inflammatory processes. You want to do it without having to ask them very much about what they're doing. So we launched with a very simple system of just tags and notes. And so I said ESR doesn't really spike. So it's not the sort of thing that you're measuring intraday. Any inflammatory marker, in fact, is relatively slow moving. Although CRP is a bit spikier because it's showing acute things like an acute infection or a gum infection, right? Or an oncoming virus or something like that. It will spike.
CRP is what for our listeners?
That's another blood biomarker. It's called C-reactive protein. And it's just another general, also non-specific, non-diagnostic inflammation marker. It's strongly overlapped with the ESR, actually, other than this issue of being an acute, CRP being more of an acute marker. But my central thesis here is that most people are not really, I don't think the best use of this is as an acute monitor. It's more of a tuning your lifestyle sort of tool. And so for that, I'd rather not have these acute spikes. The ESR is measuring not just one inflammatory protein, CRP, C-reactive protein, is a single protein. It's produced in the liver, and it's a marker of systemic inflammation, but only a single marker. ESR reflects more inflammatory pathways than does CRP, so it's broader. All of those inflammatory pathways have different half times. And so you can imagine if it's reflecting 10 different things, 10 different sources of inflammation, and each of them has a different half time, it's going to be somewhat smoothed out, the curve is. And that's indeed exactly what with ESR. But I kind of like that. I like the fact that it's not reporting acute events.
If you're walking around with a 7, then assuming you don't have some chronic disease, your lifestyle is working in a positive way. But if you're up at 30, then you know something's wrong. And what would you do then?
Yeah, if you're out of the standard reference range, and you don't know why because you've not been diagnosed with some sort of chronic condition, then you might want to reach out to your doctor and point out that and have them redo the test, because in my experience, most clinicians don't really want to, they don't, this data is available to clinicians and you can bring it to your clinician. The problem, at least in 2026, is that most clinicians will want to have their own source of knowledge. So they'll want to run their own panel and not necessarily rely on your number from the core device.
Mm-hmm.
That said, you would still maybe use it as a sign to reach out to your physician. I already know why mine was at 30. I have gallbladder disease and it needs to come out, but I haven't done it. I have about a 1-inch diameter gallstone in my gallbladder. And so I really need that procedure, but I get inflamed sometimes, and it does. So I said ESR doesn't see acute things. In this case, it does, right? It does see acute things. It just doesn't see it instantly like CRP does. So I already knew what it was. And so I did all the normal sort of lifestyle things because I don't really want to have it taken. I don't really want to go to surgery. And who does, right? And I cut back on fatty foods on my plate. I started my standard anti-inflammatory intervention, which is drinking 4 ounces of tart cherry juice before bedtime. Tart cherry juice is magic for me in terms of inflammation. So it's used, I think, pretty broadly now on sports teams. Sports teams all have tart cherry juice available for their athletes, especially after workouts. A secret weapon of sports teams. And for me, it's very it changes my number and quick before the next reading. I measure my ESR on a weekly cadence, and it'll be back down. If I have a 30, it'll be back down in the low double digits.
But what about poor sleep or for other reasons, lack of exercise? You want to bring it down with appropriate lifestyle interventions.
Yeah. So think about these anti-inflammatory strategies have knock-on effects. So tart cherry juice, for example, not to beat a dead horse here, but it has directly anti-inflammatory compounds in it. And there are dozens, if not hundreds of foods that are like that, that have known anti-inflammatory properties studied ad nauseum in the literature. But there's a knock-on effect with tart cherry juice because it has a tryptophan precursor in it. And so the reason I drink it at night is it puts me out. So I end up sleeping better. So what was the real effect, right? What really lowered my inflammation? Because if I left to my own devices, I don't sleep enough. And so this additional hour, or in studies, on average, people who were in the tart cherry group compared to the control group got 40 minutes more sleep than the other group. And so that's not nothing.
Yeah. But could lifestyle interventions like good sleep, exercise, reduce the ESR?
Yes, absolutely. We have that in our data. We have people who are reporting their sleep times, and we can see those correlations. We can see correlations. We take the data from the population and anonymize it, and we can look at it and we can see what the tags and notes are correlating to when somebody is actively lowering when a user is actively lowering their inflammation. So we see correlations like sleep. We see ketogenic eating styles as being anti-inflammatory. And interestingly, also vegan lifestyles are anti-inflammatory. We see some things that I don't understand yet. Like we see cold plunges. I don't understand what the mechanism is there. Maybe you do. And then we also see one that, you might look askance at this one, but we see grounding. People's ESR is dropping when they are practicing grounding. I don't know. I don't know. It's just for what it's worth. There's a correlation in the data.
Lifestyle interventions can bring down the inflammatory response, which then brings
Yeah,
down the markers. And then the tart cherry juice that you were suggesting would mitigate some of the effects of the inflammatory process if a person's not sleeping well or eating well.
yeah, I think that's fair.
So if a person has a high reading, then they know I've got to start introducing some lifestyle changes to
Exactly.
level them out.
Yeah, that's what when I was talking about feedback loop and the immediacy requirement. That's once you feel and know that you can make a change and it causes an effect, a cause and effect thing, but Pavlov's dog. But once you know that you are in control and in the driver's seat, yeah, the knock-on effects are huge.
Tell us about your device, actually.
Yeah. It's a very simple device because everything that I've ever invented is extremely simple. There's a hardware device. I should have brought one, but it's about the size of a modem. Hopefully it looks a bit like an Apple designed device. It sits on your desk. It plugs into a USB cable charger. It doesn't send the data over the USB. It sends the data over your Wi-Fi. So the first thing you do is you set it up on your Wi-Fi at home, and then you can. And then the second component of it is a little test tube, and it looks like you're familiar with hematocrit tubes. So there's an inner tube that is just a long, thin plastic tube that fills by capillary action. But we encase it in a cartridge so that it's easier to handle. You don't have to handle the raw hematocrit tubes. And also you can cap it. Once you filled it, you can put a cap on it, which has a septum at each end. And you do a finger stick with a lancet, and we have a clever device to make it really simple to do the lancing that comes with it. And then you get a little drop of blood and you hold it up to this capillary tube and it magically fills. Then you put the cap on and you take this tube and you put it in the reader device. It senses that and kicks off a scan. And almost instantly, it's not literally instantly, it takes about 30 minutes of the device watching the sedimentation rate. And after 30 minutes, you'll get a notification to your email that will say your result is in the app. So you go to a website, it's a web app.corehealth.com, and it'll ask you, there's a journey where you're asked to input these tags and notes that I referred to earlier before you can see your result. And then it's not too annoying, trust me. And then you click the button again and you're seeing your result from your most recent test. And then you can see all your recent results in a trend line. We express the data also in a couple different ways. There's the raw ESR, which you as a clinician would be familiar with. But ESR can also be expressed as an inflammation age, because we can compare to the population norms, and then we can say, okay, are you aging? Is your inflammation higher or lower than a person of your age and gender? Because ESR is also different for males and females. And you can then say, okay, I'm 5 years, this number puts me at 5 years younger than my chronological age. So we have a couple different, more consumery sort of ways of looking at the data.
And you were instrumental in producing the iWatch health parameters, like pulse and
Yes. Yeah, all of that. So I'm an optics guy and hardware optics spectroscopy. And so my role on the Apple Watch was I had a team. And so I didn't do all this, but my team did. We tried to think about what sort of sensors you could put in a watch form factor. And there were already people doing that, don't get me wrong. There was the Fitbit existed, as you pointed out, although the Fitbit in 2010, if you recall, it wasn't a wrist-based thing. It was like they tried clipping it on a shoe for a while, or on a pocket, or on your belt. It was more like a pedometer, right? And that's how early we were in the field of digital health. But there was a watch called the Basis, which eventually got acquired by IBM, I believe. And there were people trying to measure pulse oximetry at the wrist, or at least pulse photoplethysmography, which is just measuring the pulse rate. Or there were people trying to measure things like galvanic skin response. That's actually fallen, I think, a bit by the wayside these days because I'm not sure that a clinical meaning was ever found for it. And we looked at all these things. We looked at a temperature sensor, we looked at PPG, photoplethysmography, we looked at EKG.
That's happening now.
Yep. And so those all eventually, all the ones that I just mentioned are now part of the Apple Watch. But I and my team saw the first light, as we say, on all of those things back in 2010. So,
do you think that a wrist blood pressure monitor will ever be accurate enough to be truly useful?
I hate to say never, but there's a lot of things that need to be solved. I'm not optimistic, only because I'm usually optimistic about tech. But what I've seen is that even the current generation of blood pressure cuffs that you can buy at Walgreens and measure your blood pressure, they're not that great compared to how blood pressure was measured in the Framingham Heart Study. And now if we degrade the quality of the data even another step or two, I'm not sure how the causality is going to look. And these are not quick experiments to understand that. How long and how many subjects did the Framingham Heart Study go on? No, I'm not particularly hopeful, although I'd love it. Because I think blood pressure measured correctly is a very powerful marker.
Uh-huh. In the lead to this, I suggested that this might be a marker for warning us of an impending relapse. Is that a possibility? If the markers are high, is that a warning sign?
I think people have asked me that question. Yes, I think for somebody with a chronic condition that can relapse and have outbreaks of inflammatory processes, yes, this will see that. But I think that's a little bit closer to the medical loop than we're really focused on. I think we're really focused on, I think it's a question that gets into the next question after that might be have a medication. And what is the doctor recommending that I do in the case of an outbreak? So I don't want to step on that, right? I don't want to supersede any of that.
I guess the question is, can inflammation precede a relapse? The inflammation is an indication of probably metabolic disease.
Yeah.
And metabolic disease leads to food cravings.
I'm going to demur because I don't have the data. I don't have the data that says I can precede when a relapse. I don't have that data, and I'm very data oriented, but as you are. But when people track inflammation trends, they're noticing patterns. So we're seeing patterns, and they might in their minds correlate that with an impending event, and that's fine. But I just don't have. This creates an awareness of that, but I can't use the word precede yet based on the data that I have.
How would you compare your device with a continuous glucose monitor, CGM?
Very similar conceptually, right? In terms of how they're being used in a healthy population, quote unquote, healthy population, people without type 1 diabetes, where, you need a glucose reading in order to dose insulin. Outside of that population, CGMs are really informative to help people understand what happens after a meal. And there is a lot of diversity in how people respond to different food items. Although these things are complex. When I see diversity in how somebody responds to raspberries, I wonder if it has a little more to do with what other food they had on board, right? And the timing of their last insulin bolus from their pancreas, the naturally produced insulin. But it does provide a diversity of response, which does create an engagement loop. And I would say at that level, we're doing exactly the same thing, but not for purely metabolic disease, as is glucose, but for really any chronic disease. It's in the same ballpark, it's in the same category.
Now, I read somewhere that Apple was actually looking at some CGM-like quality with the iWatch. I don't see how that's possible.
Actually, on a theoretical basis, you can do a calculation that says you should be able to probe glucose in body fluid non-invasively. And there's 20 different ways that you might propose to do that. So I'm an optics guy. So I've actually been involved in several efforts over my career to try to send a beam of light into tissue
Oh, wow.
and have it, some of that light, which is a variety of wavelengths, have that light be absorbed by whatever it comes across, whatever the photons encounter, presumably some of which is glucose. And you can look at the specific information, whatever your technique is, whether, what kind of spectroscopy it is, that there's a characteristic pattern probably of glucose. And then you can build a model, right? And you could, in theory, if you had enough sensitivity and you had enough dynamic range, you could measure glucose non-invasively. So I would say the reason you keep hearing about it is that it is indeed theoretically possible. And that would overcome one limitation of CGMs, which is people don't like the indwelling needle. It's not really a needle, it's a catheter. And you could get around that entirely. And those indwelling things, they get fouled over time, so they don't live forever. A completely non-invasive solution would never foul up. It would just continue to work. And so, yeah, that's a really compelling thing. And I've worked on it a lot over my career. Anybody who's making a wearable is probably interested in that sort of thing. And I know how to do it. I know what things to try that have not been tried. And I also know very profoundly how not to do it. And that's unlike your blood pressure on the wrist question. The blood glucose on the wrist question, I think, is yes, that will indeed happen someday.
Well, that's encouraging to know. So
Yeah.
getting back to your advice, it sounds to me like your device would be a good complementary tool with a continuous glucose monitor, to having both of those.
Absolutely.
So with the CGM, you have that for 2 weeks and you can use that continuously or just every 2 weeks, every once in a while. How would you use your particular device?
Yeah, you would use my device so my device requires a finger stick, which up until 5 years ago, that's what you needed for glucose also. Yeah, you can, and the cadence for getting an ESR number is once a week. Some people do it even less, like once every 2 weeks or even every month. So you don't have to do it as often as you don't have to do glucose frequently. Creating a feedback loop based on glucose would not require continuous data, although the postprandial information is there and compelling. Yeah. You don't want to be pricking your finger 5 times a day.
So once a week or less.
Or less.
Is this affordable? Is it covered by any insurance plan?
It's not currently covered by insurance. There is a reimbursement code for ESR if you were doing this at a clinic, but we're selling to consumers, and so it's all self-pay. But yeah, we've tried to make it very affordable. In fact, that's one of the compelling things about ESR is that we could build it and make it an affordable measurement. It depends on your definition of affordable, obviously. The device has an upfront cost of a few $100s to $299 actually right now, $300. And then each test tube, and that comes with 5 test tubes. But then each test tube that you buy a la carte afterwards is around $10. It's $10 a test ongoing. And
where would somebody get something like that?
You get it directly off of our website, which is corehealth.com, CORHEALTH. So there's no E, it's just corehealth.com. And we put a lot of useful information on there that people can learn a little bit more, although they should just listen to your podcast. This would probably be the best explainer, but better even than I have on my website. And then there's e-commerce, so you can buy it right there and we'll send it out to you. You'll have it in a few days.
I have a fun question to ask you. What are your thoughts about the big dreams that Elizabeth Holmes had around the Theranos blood testing device, where she wanted a device that would capture everything? Do you think that will ever be possible?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I think the core idea, which is to make blood testing easier and more accessible, was absolutely right. And we're aligned, right? We want to do exactly that. The challenge is that engineering and science gets in the way. The challenge is that, and also the biology and the physics get in the way. So there are real constraints there. You cannot, anything that you can dream up is not going to be possible. And so you need a scientific rigor there. Democratizing diagnostics and diagnosing blood data is absolutely possible, but it does require rigorous engineering and validation.
But one blood drop won't do it, though. Was she ahead of her time or
Now,
just not possible?
one blood drop is in theory enough, right?
Mm.
So if you had an instrument with the
Yes.
proper amount of sensitivity, right? All the information is there.
Huh.
So that was probably her thought process. I won't try to read her mind, but
Yeah.
her thought process probably was the information is there, so I should be able to tease it out. But the reality is a little bit different, at least more difficult.
Yeah. More difficult than she thought. Okay. All right.
Yes.
Well, so you've come up with this device and you're instrumental in some of these other devices, which is actually pretty amazing. What is next for you? What's your next plan?
Oh my gosh. I'm very happy with what I'm doing. I find in technology that things are not fast. I can't pivot between ideas too quickly. And so I'll be sticking with the core device for quite a long time. There are other markers that we could extend to, but I don't want to pre-announce any products, but
Right.
there are other things that could be measured. And the platform though, and I'm going to be doing that for a while.
Can you see how you might refine the device you have right now?
We've tried a lot of in terms of refining. What might you want to do? You might want to use less blood, or you might want to look at so let me just cover that one first. We looked at less blood, and that doesn't work, right? We did develop around a particular blood volume, and we couldn't go lower. You might want to do it in less time, but we also found that we couldn't do that. So I'll circle back to those problems at some point, but right now we're doing it in as little time as we can with as little blood as we can. One thing that's really fascinating me right now, keeps me up at night actually, so it's causing my inflammation to go up. But
Right.
what other information is in the sed rate? Because
Mm.
the sedimentation rate is not constant. There's an early phase, there's this rouleau formation where the blood cells clump together. And then there's the falling phase, if you will. So blood sits there for a while. It doesn't start sedimenting immediately, and then it does. And so, what other information? I'm keenly interested right now in what other information we can tease from the data that we have, or some modification of our device to maybe we measure longer and see what happens after the 30 minutes, that sort of thing.
Is there any correlation between the clumping of the erythrocytes and platelets so that you might make some correlation between, I don't
Maybe
know,
so. Yeah,
stroke
yeah.
activity or potential clotting?
That's a good thought. It's a good thought. That's not on my radar, but yeah, it's a very good thought.
Okay, so those are the kind of questions that you're
Those are the kinds of
yeah.
questions. Exactly. Yes.
Okay, good. Is there anything else that I haven't asked you about this process or your device that you'd like to speak about?
I don't think so. It really is that simple that anybody can do it, and it's right at home. You don't have to worry about sending blood out anywhere. You don't have to worry about going to the phlebotomist, obviously. You do that anyway, but that's more like a 3, 6, 12-month cadence. And it's really pretty simple.
We have a signature question that we end our podcast with, which is if you could tell a younger version of yourself something about the ESR or about your device, what would it be?
I think I probably already leaked or pre-gave the answer to this, but this is the rule that I live by. And that is that the most powerful technologies are often the simplest ones. This was Steve Jobs's mantra. It's friction is the enemy, right? If you can make it simpler, that's the better way to go. What we did here was rediscovered an old idea and applied it in a new context, and unlocks a completely new way of thinking for people to understand health. And there are other ideas like that. That's a good general way to approach digital health.
Okay, thank you very much for spending the time to talk with us.
Thank you very much, Vera. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us this week on Food Junkies Recovery from Food Addiction. Make sure to join our Facebook group, Sugar Free for Life Support Group, I'm Sweet Enough. Molly and Clarissa are food addiction professionals who offer one-to-one counseling and group coaching through Sweet Sobriety. Please subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in today's episode, we'd appreciate you leaving us a review on your favorite platform. Your feedback helps grow our show and allows us to reach others who need to hear this message of recovery. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies. And as Vera always says, the power is ours.